Solidarity, a deep dive with artists, authors, and activists during this ongoing COVID pandemic. I am Joe Ramsey, one of your hosts tonight, Zoomcasting from Dorchester, Massachusetts, and I am joined, I'm very happy to say, I'm joined by my co-host, Rachel. Rachel, make sure you're unmuted, and Rachel, take it away. Introduce yourself, Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Euratius Patton. I'm here at the UMass Boston campus. How are you doing?
All right, Rachel, I'm doing great tonight. It is great to have you with us, and it is really terrific to be joined tonight by Professor Richard Wolff for our discussion of his new book, The Sickness is the System. And as we've built this show, Dying for Capitalism, ? Capitalism as the disease, the sickness as the system. Professor Wolff, thank you for being here with us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And please understand, nothing is more important to me as I do my work than to being useful to groups like yours that are trying to begin to move this country in every part of it. That's the most important thing that I can see. And I'm very happy to be whatever helpful ways I can to what you're trying to do.
Well, that is just a beautiful way to start the show, and we really appreciate that, Rick. I'm going to, just for those few folks on this call who may not be familiar with Professor Wolff's work, just going to briefly read a very short bio. Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, and When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, which can be found along with his other books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at www.democracyatwork.info. That's democracyatwork.info. We're going to get right into questions here. I know folks want to hear from Professor Wolff, so I'm going to kick the first question over to Rachel. Rachel, take it away.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start this interview the same way that you started your book, by telling some of the commonly known myths about the economy that so many people just accept as facts. I would love for you to go through some of those and to maybe tell us why those myths are so persistent.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start dealing with this in a historical way, because I have found in all of my life as a teacher that putting things in a historical context is one of the best ways to make them understood. So I'm going to go back to the French and American revolutions back in the 18th century, which is the time we normally date when the previous economic system, feudalism, was finally overthrown. And in this case, by violent revolutions, particularly in France and the United States, but it was in other countries too. And they were against feudalism, those revolutionaries. For example, here in the United States, we didn't just want to be independent of Great Britain. We didn't just want not to have King George III continue to be the sovereign. We didn't replace King George when we won our independence with another king. I had no intention of doing that. And we didn't replace European feudalism with an American variety. We broke with all of that. And we developed a different economic system, capitalism. And the same thing in the French Revolution. And the place I want to start is by pointing out that those two revolutions brought forward a kind of agenda, if you like, for what it was that the transition to capitalism was supposed to enable, bring to our people everywhere. In France, they did it, in French style. They came up with 3 words: liberty, equality, fraternity. The American Revolution agreed with all of that. Thomas Jefferson and the others, that they were all part of this kind of break, but they added this other word, democracy, so that capitalism would replace feudalism and bring with it liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. Well, the basic critique of capitalism starts right there, namely with the historical observation that we sure got capitalism, and feudalism is a vague memory, but the liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy that the capitalist revolution promised has never been delivered. If I were harsh, and I try not to be, I would refer to those as false promises. I don't need to explain to you about inequality. I mean, because we live here in the United States at a time when capitalism has delivered levels of inequality that require us to go back to ancient Egypt and the Pharaoh to come up with something like this. A few weeks ago, many of us watched as the two richest men in the United States, each possessing around $200 billion each, competed with one another to spend tens of millions of dollars to spend 8 or 9 minutes in a rocket ship going around the earth. This while we have unspeakable poverty all over the world, this while people are dying as we speak of a disease they do not have to die from, and I could go on, but you know all of that. And what about liberty? What about brotherhood or fraternity? I must tell you, in all my effort to not be harsh, that these things don't exist for most people in this planet. Capitalism has not brought any of that. We don't treat each other as brothers. Again, just a simple example. I am an American citizen. I have had not only 2 vaccinations against COVID, I've now had the booster shot. But in Africa, it's still less than 6% of the people in that continent have got any shot. This is crazy. This has nothing to do with what I understand to be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or any other ethics or morality in which we take care of ourselves and watch the rest of the world die. So I don't see it. And perhaps most important, I don't see democracy. And I'm going to stress there one kind of democracy because it's the one you may not have thought about. If democracy means anything, it means that if you are affected by a decision, then democracy says you have an inalienable right to participate in making that decision, since you are required to live with its results. I mean, basically, that's the idea why we vote for the local mayor or the president or anybody in between. The idea is they make decisions that certainly affect us, and so we must have some input. And even if you're not satisfied, the vote is at least something. Well, then let's look at capitalism. Capitalism is a system for organizing the production and distribution of goods and services. It is different from other ways of doing that. In feudalism, you had a lord and a serf. In slavery, you have a master and a slave. That's how they organized the production and distribution of goods and services. For most of the history of the human race, we organized the distribution after we had produced goods according to social or religious rules. Modern capitalism doesn't use masters and slaves. It doesn't use lords and serfs. And it doesn't have religious or historical rules for distributing goods and services. Modern capitalism is distinctive because it organizes the workplace not by master slave, not by lord and serf, but by something we call employer and employee. And it doesn't distribute goods and services by religious or moral rules. It delivers them by a very unusual institution, namely called the market, an arrangement in which I come with whatever it is I have to sell, and I confront you with whatever it is you have to sell, and we negotiate some terms of exchange. So I give you my apples, and you give me your pencils, or whatever it is you and I each made. So that's what's distinctive about capitalism. Well, let's look at the workplace in capitalism. And by that, I'm going to use contemporary examples. A contemporary factory, a contemporary office, a contemporary store. Those of you who've had to work for a living, you know very well, even if you haven't put it in these words, that every day when you cross the threshold into the place where you work, you are entering a space from which democracy has been excluded from the beginning of this country's history to this minute. When you go to work and you hang up your coat, you sit down where somebody tells you is your place. You work with whatever equipment they provide. You do whatever task they tell you to. You use the technology they have chosen. And at the end of the day, something very interesting happens. You are told, go home. Whatever you did during the day, using your brains and your muscles, instantaneously belongs to the employer. Your job is to go home, have a beer, maybe 6, and a pizza, maybe 6, and get ready to come back tomorrow and do it all again. Do you vote for your employer? Never. Is your employer accountable to you for the decisions he or she makes? Absolutely not. Your employer decides what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output, and you are excluded from every one of those decisions. The capitalist workplace has never permitted democracy to enter. And let me be real clear with you. Democracy is very easy to explain in capitalism because all of you already know. It's one of those interesting psychological realities. You don't know, but upon closer investigation, you do. Here's how it works. Everybody in the workplace has one vote. The skilled technician, the unskilled technician. Just like when you go to elect the mayor, everybody gets a vote, whether they've had PhD or a GED or anything else. And the workplace could be organized democratically. One person, one vote, majority decision decides what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with it. But we don't have a democratic workplace, except in a tiny number of very specialized workplaces that have been formed by people who care about all of this. And they have a name here in the United States. They're called worker co-ops. And maybe later we'll talk a bit about them. But for the moment, I'm answering Rachel's question, and I'm telling you that the workplace is a fundamentally anti-democratic institution. It's organized like an autocracy. Whoever owns the business, if it's an individual or a family, if it's a partnership, if it's a board of directors of a corporation, it is a tiny minority of the people whose lives are affected by that workplace. First and foremost, do you have a job? Can you keep the job? Can you earn a living? The employer has the right in capitalism to fire you, to take away from you your livelihood, throwing you, your family, the future of your children, all into a turmoil. And capitalists jealously guard that right. So let me tell you where this argument ends in the interest of time. Most adults in the United States and every other capitalist country, most adults spend most of their adult life in the workplace. 5 out of 7 days in most cases, 40 hours, the best hours of those 5 days. And when you're not at work, you're getting ready in the morning and putting on your makeup or coming back and recuperating. You add up all the hours, that's where you give an enormous part of yourself. So don't call this a democratic country, because the place where most adults spend most of their time is exactly the opposite of democracy. So we don't have democracy. We never did. We allow a formal kind of it. Every year we can go into a little booth, move a little handle, and we voted. And I'm glad we have that. But to consider that as qualifying you for a democratic society means you don't know what the word means, or you're trying to put lipstick on a pig. And that doesn't change the pig. Okay, so for me, if I had to, that's the most fundamental mythology about capitalism, that it is the brother or sister of democracy, or that it's the vehicle that brings us democracy. It doesn't. It's precisely the most important institution preventing liberty, equality, and democracy. It's not just that it isn't democratic, but it holds it back. And let me conclude by summarizing how that works. If a tiny number of people sitting at the top of every enterprise, factory, office, store, is in a position to tell the vast majority of people, the employees, what to do, how to do, where to do, and all the rest, then no one should be surprised that in capitalism, the fruits of an enterprise, the output of the factories and the offices and the stores, is taken by the people who have all the power inside the enterprise to make sure it works for them. The employees are basically there to do a job and get paid. Everything else is in the hands of the others. So why are we surprised that they take the lion's share of the output for themselves and thereby become very wealthy and try not to have to give up any of it to the employees? Why are we surprised? Inequality is the fruit of organizing the production system in this employer-employee way. And here's another example.
Professor Wolff, if I could just jump in with question number
Please.
2 here. I mean, I think you're bringing in so much. I'm still
Fine.
thinking about well, I mean, the pizza and beer reference made me think, like the way in which capitalism denies us democracy, but offers us so many choices of types of pizza and beer, as if to substitute consumer choice for choice over determining our lives. But I mean, you've already gone to the contemporary moment in talking about pandemic vaccine inequality, but I wanted to kind of connect directly to the title of your book, right? The Sickness is the System, which makes it very clear that you see the unfolding crises, public health as well as economic, that we face as not just the effect of kind of this thing called COVID-19, but rather as expressions of inherent features of capitalism itself. I mean, you've begun spelling out some of those inherent features already. But we want to ask you, how so does the recent COVID pandemic, not so recent now, but ongoing, exemplify what you see as the problem with capitalism and the need for something else? if you could kind of bring, bring the COVID-19 crisis into the picture as you continue your analysis, that would be terrific.
Perfect. Let me focus then on that. I'm a professor of economics. That's what I've done all my life. And one of the things modern economics stresses is how the goal of every enterprise in capitalism, we call that to maximize profit. If you talk to people who teach in a business school or are economists, they will use phrases like profit is the bottom line. And we here at this business or that one, our job is to minimize the costs and maximize the revenues so that we get the best profit that we can. And if we get a lot of profit, we can grow and be considered successful. And if we fail at that, well, we don't grow and maybe we go out of business, okay? This notion that profit is crucial, keep that in your mind because that's a distinguishing feature of capitalism. It makes the fundamental goal of the enterprise not the well-being of the people who work there, not the well-being of the people who live in the surrounding community, but the profit of the owners of the enterprise. That's what everyone is hired to maximize. So let me show you where that can lead by telling you how it shaped the US experience with COVID-19. Okay, here we go. Viruses that threaten human beings are nothing new. Viruses that are threatening have existed for millennia in the natural world. We know how dangerous they are. About 100 years ago, the United States had a terrible pandemic based on a virus. That virus started in a military camp in Kansas, the state of Kansas. It got a strange name for historical reasons, which I'll be glad to tell you about if you're interested. So it was called all over the world the Spanish flu, but it actually started in the great old USA. Don't tell the Chinese, they are still struggling not to be blamed for the current one. Anyway, the pandemic of 1918, which is when it hit, killed about 700,000 people in the United States. So almost as many as have now died from COVID in this country. Wow. So we know all about that danger. Plus, in more recent years, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had Ebola. We know, the medical profession knows, government official know that viruses are a constant threat. And you have to be, here we go now, if you give a damn about what we call public health, you have to be prepared. It's a little bit like you having a jar of aspirin in your bathroom. So if you get sick, you can give somebody an aspirin or have a Band-Aid. I mean, this is not rocket science. Okay, so here becomes now the problem. When COVID-19 hits the United States in March of the year 2020, guess what? We weren't prepared. What do I mean? We didn't have stocks of masks and tests and ventilators and ICU units and emergency facilities carefully located around the country where our population is so that we could handle what we knew we had to be prepared for. Well, why weren't we? Well, the answer is, here we go, the profit motive of capitalism. We allow things like tests and ventilators and masks to be privately produced by companies whose purpose is not to prepare for a virus, but instead to maximize their profits. And so they did what they're supposed to. They looked at the world and they said, we could produce tests and masks and all the rest. But you know, it's expensive to produce them. Then it's expensive to distribute them in warehouses around the country where they need to be. And then we'll have to wait who knows how many years before they're actually needed when the next sickness hits. That's too risky. That's not profitable enough. So what did they do? They made other things that were more profitable because that's what they learned to do when they got their MBA at the business school. So why didn't we get prepared? Because the private capitalist system is not about solving social problems like being prepared for something you know very well is going to be a problem sooner or later. By the way, other countries, even other capitalist countries who don't have the profit motive so uppermost in their minds as we do here in America, were able to be prepared. And you know, there's an easy way it could have been done. The government could have come in, the US government, and it could have said to these companies, okay, you won't do it because as private capitalists, that's not how you work. We get it. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to order from you right now 50 million masks and 100 million testing kits and whatever. And then we, the government, will buy them from you as fast as you produce them. So you'll know your profit. There'll be no risk, no waiting. We, the government, will put those things in warehouses and we'll wait for however long it takes, keeping them safe, keeping them well kept good temperature and humidity and repaired if they break. The government will do it. How do I know that the government could do that? Because the US government already does that, but not for public health. Where does the government come in? Well, there's another industry, it turns out, that has the same problem. It's called the defense industry. It's all those people who make tanks. Guess what? If you're a tank producer, what are you going to do? Produce a tank, then what? Stick it in a warehouse. That's expensive. Secure it, clean it, preserve it, and for how long? Who the hell knows when the next war will become? That's too risky. That's not profitable. Guess what? If you leave it to capitalism, we wouldn't have an army. So the government comes in and takes all the risk away. The government says, you make them, we'll buy them, and then we, the government, by the way, at taxpayer expense, stores the stuff, repairs the stuff, maintains the stuff, and for how long? Until the next war comes along to make use of them. So everybody knows how to solve this problem. But in our society, we failed to do that. The government didn't come in and do in the medical care, in the public health interest, what it did for the military. And I could go if you're interested into why, but I want to draw you the implications. The United States has a population of 330 million people. That is roughly 4.5% of the population of this planet. But we account for nearly 20% of the people who have died from COVID. One of the richest countries in the world with a highly developed medical system is a disaster for itself. It destroyed almost 1 million people if you count properly. I know the official is in the neighborhood of 750,000, but there's a lot of undercount. Well, eventually we'll get the number right. It's an enormous catastrophe.
And Professor
And
Wolff,
it's because of a profit-focused system. Why in the world would you put something as fundamental as the public health into a position where this could even begin to happen? If an economic system has any justification, one of the first ones is keep the people alive, keep the people functioning. And if you can't do that, capitalism, you've lost your claim on our loyalty.
well said, Professor Wolff. And I think, one of the things about your work, you really have a real talent and a skill for drawing out these kind of glaring double standards, as you just did with respect to the so-called defense industry and the public health defense that we really needed this last couple of years. I want to follow up, though, with what might sound like devil's advocacy. It's how, of course, we need to conjure the devil here. We don't have a lot of pro-capitalists involved in this production of shelter and solidarity. But some have now, with the creation of the vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, we're actually hearing a narrative out there that actually it seems to almost try to erase the kinds of lessons you've just called attention to by underscoring, right, the innovative genius of capitalism, maybe holding as if to hold out a hope that maybe capitalism can produce the vaccines for the problems that it generates or that it encounters. And look how innovative and effective and how relatively quickly these private corporations develop these vaccines. Isn't this proof that capitalism still has a claim on our loyalty, even if it's so abusive and undemocratic, yada, yada, yada? What's your take on the vaccine development and deployment process and what it actually reveals about the system we're living under?
I don't understand how that could be a defense of anything. I'm the first one to agree that if we, as a society, decided we wanted to have a preparation for viruses, of course we could do that. And if we wanted as a society to have in place the laboratories and the scientific personnel to respond to any new illness with a maximum effort, we could, of course we could do it. But the point is, we don't. We don't over and over again. And to take the example of the vaccines, let's be real clear. The vaccines were produced because the government took away all capitalist risk. It guaranteed I'm all shot up with vaccines. I didn't pay a nickel. I don't pay anything. None of you have to pay either. But of course, you think those companies are giving us those vaccines for free? Don't be crazy. They are all paid for. And in fact, you're paying for them only through your taxes. They go to the government, and the government said to these companies, you have no risk. I want you to take, half your laboratory scientists and go to work on this virus. I love it. If you have a concentrated commitment to do something right, you can do it. We don't. We come up when it's too late to do the viruses. If we had been properly prepared, we wouldn't need the dependence on Let me drive it home, which may upset some of you, but it's the truth. And you've got to look at it sooner or later. The People's Republic of China is a country 4 times larger than our own. Most estimates put the population of People's Republic somewhere between 1.3 and 1.4 billion people. 4 times the number of people, and a much poorer country than the United States. You know how many dead people have died from COVID in China? Between 7 and 8,000. We have between 7 and 800,000. A country 4 times larger has a tiny 1% fraction of the deaths from COVID. That's not just a failure. That is, I lack the capacity of vocabulary to capture this. And by the way, why did the Chinese do a better job? And they're not the only ones. Don't think that I picked a country that's socialist because it's the only solution. Take a look at New Zealand, not a socialist country, but it does have an extraordinary leader, and she is so effective. If you don't know the leader of New Zealand, go find out about her. You're one of the greatest leaders the world has right now. And for those of you that are women, okay, it's a woman, and that you don't see that very often. Not that it's the whole explanation, but you don't have to be a socialist country. You have to be a country that can mobilize public and private resources to get the job done to which you give a priority. And saving the lives of 1 million people, that ought to be, if you're any morality at all, a primary objective. So what did the Chinese do? They mobilized all the resources. The public, the private, they have a huge private economic sector in China. So don't think of it, huge part of their production and distribution of goods is capitalist enterprises, both Chinese and foreign, that are busy there. But the government maintains a control and a dominance and an ability to focus its resources. And by the way, it's not just for emergencies like COVID, where they have outperformed the United States on a scale that is so enormous that you don't hear about it very much because it's so embarrassing. But let me give you two other indices. I'm just an economist. I'm just giving you the numbers. You can see what you want to do with them as you like. For the last 25 years, one of the basic statistics that all economists use is something called GDP, and it stands for gross domestic product. Think of it as the total output of goods and services. So it's a kind of measure of how big an economy is and how it's growing. And one of the big things we look at is the annual growth of GDP in every country. So for the last 25 years, the average annual growth of GDP in the United States has been between 2 and 2.5%, maybe 3%. Over the exact same 25 years, the rate of growth of the People's Republic of China GDP has averaged between 6 and 9%. Do you understand the Chinese economy is growing 3 times faster than the United States, which is why economists expect it will pass the United States as a total economy before the end of the decade we're already in. Now, let me give you another final statistic. One of the things economists are interested in is what we call real wages. What that is the amount of money you get in your pay envelope relative to the prices you have to pay for the milk and the eggs and the shirts and all the stuff you have to buy. So it's an adjustment of your wage to take into account what you can afford to buy with it. The real wage in the United States over the last 25 years has been what we call in America stagnant. It's gone nowhere. The truth of it is, and by the way, explains a great deal of the turmoil in our country, that the average real wage in this country is the same today as it was around 1980. We have subjected our people to 40 years of going nowhere, which has had 2 consequences you have to keep in mind. Number one, how then do we account for the rising consumption level of our people? Well, you know the answer. Starting in 1980, the American people took on a level of debt no working class in the history of the world ever carried before. Americans are drowning in debt. Think about it. Think about it. Back to the real wage. Over the last 25 years, that real wages have been stagnant in the United States. I'm now going to tell you what happened to the real wage of the average Chinese worker. Ready? It quadrupled. It's 4 times today what it was 25 years ago. Now you can play around and dance around and fool yourself, but the world doesn't stay still because Americans need to deny what's going on in the world. I know for 20 years we were told that we're going to have a surge and we're going to have this and we're going to win the war in Afghanistan. Oh, we all now know that that was, to use a technical term, bullshit. And we lost. And we're about to have the same experience in Iraq. Okay? And we already lost Vietnam. We're not doing real well, friends. And it's buried left and right because we live in a country that is now suffering from denial on a scale that is mind-bending. But for all of these reasons, it's precisely what we could have accomplished when we did focus our scientific community in the only way you can get that done when there's profit in the way, by guaranteeing profits. And if you have any doubt, let me invite you to do a little experiment you can do on your own. There are only 6 or 7 major drug companies in the United States. You know their names. Go look up what happened to their shares, value of their stocks over the last 2 years, 6 years, 12 years. Pharmaceuticals are one of the greatest profit engines in this country, and they have been for a long time. And that's because they have a monopoly. Insurance companies, those four industries have what's called a group monopoly. How do I know? One final statistic, because I don't want to throw them all at you at once. The United States spends a bigger share of its GDP on healthcare than any other country in the world. And no other country is even close. Is that because we take care of the health of our people more than others? Not at all. If you look, for example, at longevity, how many years people live on average, we're mediocre. We're in the middle. We're the only major country that in the last 4 years has seen life expectancy shrink in the United States. No, the country has this. We're achieving these dubious milestones. Wow. Wow. And you know, a reasonable person would scratch his or her head. We pay more for healthcare than anybody else, and our results in terms of our health are mediocre. Normally, if it was rationality here, you would question a system that works like that. It's on is the denial and the mental refusal to face. But you know, I don't want to be mean-spirited. I really don't. So I need to ask the question, why? And let me leave this part of our conversation with a general thought. From 1820 to 1970, the United States was an exceptional capitalist economy. The people who set it up came from Europe. They were not nice to the local people. They slaughtered them. The first ethnic cleansing right here. But that gave them a continent, having extinguished the local population, except for a few. And they took that continent and they created a capitalism that could just go, because unlike in Europe, it wasn't held back by centuries of feudalism and all these other traditions. If you're a tourist today and you go to France, you go and you look at magnificent chateaus, but those come from a pre-capitalist society. They're beautiful, and capitalism has never been able to make anything as beautiful, which is why the tourists go there. But this system took off. And from 1820 to 1970, it made a lot of money, it developed its technology, and it outgalloped every other competitor. Above all, the three big competitor countries: Britain, from whom we had split, Germany, which was the other up and coming, and Japan. And in World War I, Britain and Germany wrecked each other. And in World War II, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Americans demolished Japan. So we, the American economy, has had no serious economic competitor for a century. The Soviet Union was so far behind economically that it was never a threat that way. It had nuclear weapons, that's an issue, but we are in an entirely new situation, friends. And for those of you that are young, this is your life laying out before you. The People's Republic of China is the first serious competitor this country has had in a century. By 1970, the American experienced this growth, explosive growth for 150 years, which, by the way, created in America this idea that we are exceptional, because no other country had that. No other country had that 150 years of growth. Nobody had an empty continent cleared of people, very well, fertile and with good harbors and rivers and all the things the United States had. So it took off. Wow. But by 1970, it couldn't grow anymore the way it had. And so things started to change. Large numbers of American capitalists left the United States. That's why, if you look at the label on your shirt or your underpants or your socks, you already know what you'll find. Not made here, made over there. China, India, Brazil, you name it. They left. They're all patriotic on the 4th of July, but when the money counts, they left because wages are cheap out there. And that's why it's so cheap that it pays to move your factory from Cincinnati to Shanghai and then pay for bringing that crap all the way back here because you're still going to be ahead, which is why they left. And the other factories, when they couldn't leave, replaced their workers with machines. That's what the computer allowed them to do. And for the service industries that can't move abroad and can't use a machine, they brought in cheap immigrants in huge numbers. And that made them a ton of money. Being in the stock market over the last 25 years, smart move. But for the rest of the people, down. And they staved off the unpleasant recognition of what was happening to them by borrowing money like it was going out of style. Borrow for your home, that's called a mortgage. Borrow for your car, that's that monthly payment. Borrow for your everyday bottle of water by using your credit card at the local bodega. And then the really new one, when that wasn't enough debt to drown you in, college debt. Spend the money to get your kid to get a degree, which is less useful for getting a good job than it ever was. What kind of a society functions like this? A big, fat capitalist one, because everything's about making the money. And that's my argument, because if you want to produce well, the Americans have shown they can do that. American workers are perfectly good. We can produce all kinds of things and we do a good job. But the profit gets in the way. And the people who are concentrating on making profit, that's their focus. And you all have to ask yourself, as I do, if we want public health, if we want decent housing for our people, if we want education that allows every person to get as much skill and intellectual capability as he or she is capable of getting, well, then we can't have these institutions be focused on something else called profit. Absolutely. And if you believe, as the conservatives want you to, that by some magic, a capitalist trying to maximize profit will end up doing what's best for all of us, if you actually believe that, then I want to sell you a special corner in the Brooklyn Bridge.
Absolutely. Professor Wolff, I think you've been raising a very important question, which is, how is it possible so few people seem to see through this within the mainstream of this country? I think Rachel has our next question, picking up on that note in particular. Rachel?
So picking up on that idea of denial, of noticing this historical decline, I'm studying economics myself, and it's so shocking to me how few economists are able to just see what seems so obvious and to question like the basic assumption that capitalism is the most effective method of allocating resources and distributing. Like it seems so clear. And as a Marxian economist, there's so little space for that kind of critical engagement. So I want to ask you, why is it so hard to come across heterodox approaches in economics? How has academia purposefully been crafted to sort of support these narratives, to support this ideology?
Good, I'm glad you asked, because it really is my life, and I can tell you the story as I experienced it as well. My parents were immigrants to the United States. I was born in Ohio. I'm as American as it comes. but neither my father nor my mother were, they became American citizens, but they arrived as immigrants. And if you're the child of immigrants, as I was, and if you're the first child of immigrants, which I was, you are under a tremendous psychological pressure, which I really would not wish on anyone, but that was the roll of the dice. That's what I had to do. And I had to make up to my parents what was destroyed or interrupted in their lives. My mother couldn't ever finish college. She had hoped to. My father couldn't stay with his chosen profession. They came to the United States. They didn't have a nickel, and they had to kind of scrabble around. But I had to make up for them. So I had to always get good grades in school, and I had to play the violin in the orchestra, and I had to play on the football team. I did all those. I actually did. And as a result, you become quasi-hysterical. You have a lot of psychological problems, which I will not share with you. I have to know you better before that happens. But I had the following academic experience to answer your question. I started off, and since you're in Massachusetts, you will understand what I'm about to tell you. I went to Harvard. My undergraduate experience was 4 years down the road there in Harvard Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts. When I finished, I went to Stanford in California for my graduate work in economics. I only stayed a year because Stanford was, how shall I put it, a boring, dead place. And so I left there after a year and finished my education in New Haven, Connecticut at Yale University. So you're listening to a poster boy for elite education. I have all the pedigrees that this system offers. Okay, so I had the teachers who tried very hard to persuade me that capitalism is absolutely the best thing that has happened in the world since sliced bread. Okay, they tried. I also had fellow students who were eager, smart people, and wanted to absorb, as students usually do, what the teacher offered to tell. And if you go through that kind of a system, you learn an awful lot. My classmates at Yale, for example, you might be interested to know, included a woman, and that was very rare. In those days, economics was a field that men dominated in every way. All my teachers were male, and the vast majority of my fellow students were male. So when there was a woman, we all noticed, oh, there's a different kind of person over there on that sheet. Her name was Janet Yellen. Okay, that's my life. 20 semesters, 10 years I spent, 10 consecutive years, 2 semesters each, Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Now here's what you're going to learn. On only one semester, it happened in Stanford, one semester, one professor gave me some books and articles, the whole class, not just me, but assigned some books and articles that were critical of capitalism. One. The other 19 semesters can be honestly referred to as learning how to be a cheerleader for capitalism. It's efficient. It arrives at a wonderful equilibrium that has the quality of optimizing the general welfare. The very language of this discipline reveals a lot. That's what I was taught. Economics as it's taught in the university, and by the way, I've taught at Yale, I've taught at the City University of New York, I taught at UMass in Amherst, and I teach now at the New School. So I've done a lot of, and I taught in Europe, and because my parents were immigrant, I was fluent in French and German before I learned English. So I can move around because I speak those languages. So, okay. I would raise my hand because I was becoming a little loudmouth lefty already in college. And I would raise my hand and I would ask a question about Marx or about problems of capitalism. And I very quickly noticed something. It happened at Harvard, again at Stanford, and again at Yale. Some of my teachers, by the way, were very, very good. Some were mediocre, like anywhere else. But I noticed that when I asked those questions, something that I could recognize as naked fear crossed the faces. You know, nobody said anything, but just looking at another person's eyes, their eyes were saying to me, don't go there. Don't push this. Don't ask these questions. And they were asking me almost as a kind of kindness to back off. And because I'm not a nasty guy, and because these were perfectly nice people, I backed off. I learned the Marxism on my own, together with other students that were also interested. But I have to tell you, when I started going to school, and we're going all the way back now to the 1950s and 60s, there was no exposure to Marxism, socialism, anarchism, communism, none of it. My generation doesn't know anything. Janet Yellen, good student, clever young woman, clever older woman. I got nothing, you know, I don't agree with her, but she's fine. But when we all got together, her fellow students, to study Marxism, she never came. This was not her interest. This was not her career path. And look where she is. She chose well. She's arrived. I'm the weird one. I'm the black sheep. I'm the odd, what's this about kind of person. But that's the reality. What you're living through is the results of all of that period. Nobody produced Marxian economics. The only reason, I don't mind revealing this to you, the only reason that I spent so much of my time at UMass Amherst, there's a simple reason, because they offered me and 4 other people, all of us, by the way, males, white males, they offered us a job none of us could refuse. I was at the tender age of 27, the University of Massachusetts offers me tenure, no waiting, no, not right on the spot. Come here, you will have tenure, and your job will be to teach Marxian economics. I thought I wasn't hearing right, because that never happens. So you are talking to the exception, but it's that famous exception that proves the rule. They hired us. And you know, the other 4, I don't know, the names may mean nothing to you. Samuel Bowles, he's the one who put it together. Why Sam Bowles? Well, why do you think we got the job? Sam was an undergraduate at Yale who went to graduate school at Harvard. And I was a student that was an undergraduate at Harvard and went to school. Get the picture? If you didn't have these pedigrees, you didn't get that job. It had nothing to, I could have taught, you know, underwater basket weaving for all it mattered. They were hiring the pedigree, which is normally what's done. You know, and so I have a job that comes out of another part of me. They didn't care about this. Nobody has ever cared about a balanced curriculum. If you ever hear an economist talk to you about a balanced curriculum, go talk to somebody else, because you're in the presence of somebody who's either an ignoramus or a hustler. And you don't want to waste your time with either one of these characters. In American academic life, between 1945 and 1975, everybody was a Keynesian economist. All my teachers were, all of them. And my professors, I'll give you an example. The person who taught me macroeconomics at Yale was a man named James Tobin. You may have heard his name because he later won a Nobel Prize in economics and all of that. He used to make jokes in class. And you know, if you're a graduate student in a small room with a famous professor, one of the things you learn early on is when the professor tells a joke, you laugh. And maybe the lamest joke you ever heard, but you laugh with as much of a full throat as you can manage to make him like you and to feel good about you. And which of course I did too. He would make fun of this crazy economist. That's what he called him. Named what? Milton Friedman in Chicago. A kook, a loony. And I laughed each time because he was the only place where neoclassical economics was still kind of there. After 1970, it reversed. all the Keynesians were basically kicked out, and the neoclassicals, led by those who had gone to school in Chicago, came in and took over. They hate each other, they fire each other, they do all kinds of things, not just professional, but personal, very ugly. And one of the very few things that neoclassical and Keynesian economists have ever agreed on is the importance of keeping Marxists out of the curriculum altogether. That they can agree upon. That is something they see the importance of. It's embarrassing. I mean, I'm not any more angry. I was angry when I was younger about it because it was really right in my face. But no, taking a step back, you can realize this has been a country that had no limits. You know, the Cold War was a reality. The Soviet Union was scary for them. And the result was the behavior of a 3-year-old. I mean, the 3-year-old, who's scared by the dog that's barking, and he or she, the little kid, puts his or her hands in front of her eyes because she thinks, since she's 3, that if you can't see it, it isn't there. In the United States, we acted as a nation for half a century, as though Marxism and socialism we're not taking it seriously. Let me put it this way. For most of my adult life, when I would go out speaking, say for every 3 months, somebody would ask to talk to the professor, and they knew a little bit about me. Now, by the way, just to show you how much America has changed, I do 3 or 4 radio and television interviews every day. You, right now, are my 5th television or internet type appearance. The demand for what I do is now enormous. And because of American history, the supply chain has been interrupted. There aren't very many of us, right? Clearly. But the world has completely changed. But you're surrounded by an economy run by people who have no idea about the critique of capital. None. By the way, that's one of the reasons they don't do real well with these downturns. Because there's no course saying, here's a little piece of information that ought to be in every economics curriculum. The National Bureau of Economic Research, that's an agency that works with the United States government. So its politics are, of course, wonderful. They keep track of economic downturns. And here's what they show. Wherever capitalism has become the economic system in the world, anywhere, whether it was in the 18th, 19th, 20th, or currently, wherever capitalism settles, it has an economic downturn on average every 4 to 7 years. Wow. Whatever the country, whatever the history, you know what that means? It means this system is stupefyingly unstable. Every 4 to 7 years. That means in your lifetime or mine, many times we're going to be in an economy that suddenly throws large numbers of people out of work, that suddenly destroys many small, medium, and even large businesses. How do you plan your life? How do you buy a house, wondering whether you're going to be fired in one of these episodes? Every 4 to 7 years, it crashes. By the way, just so you know how good the job is that the NBER did. Look at this century, the 21st century, 21 years old. We had a crash in the spring of 2000 called the dot-com crash. Then we had a crash in 2008 called the subprime mortgage crash. And now in 2020, we have a crash we call the COVID crash. 3 crashes, 21 years, every 7 years, right on schedule. You might think this would work to get some attention, that there would be courses in the economics curriculum, crises, crashes, recessions, depressions, why they happened, why they weren't prepared for, why they weren't handled real well, and why capitalism, which has been frightened by and upset by every crash for 300 years and has tried everything it could think of to stop them, has failed. That's why we're going through another one and a doozy right now. This ought to be right up there with stuff you learn. you'll look long and hard. Most economics departments have no course on the business cycle, which is the sanitized name they give it. None. We're all supposed to pretend that this malady which afflicts this sick system isn't there. More of that denial. At this point, when I give lectures, I lean across the podium, trying to hold the attention of my audience, and I say, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago.
I love it, Professor Wolff. And I mean, again, you demonstrate these analogies, these kind of everyday comparisons and juxtapositions that really illuminate these concepts in such a clear and humorous way. I mean, I wanted to ask a question building on Rachel's last one. I mean, you're someone who has had many, prestigious university positions, produced academic work, but for years now, perhaps even decades, you have also, and maybe even more prominently, adopted the role of kind of a public intellectual. Actually, very impressed that this is your fifth. I'm glad you're drinking some water.
Yes.
This being your fifth, obviously exuberant presentation of the day, which is a lot even from someone. I'm teaching 4 courses right now and doing this, so I can relate, but nonetheless impressive. And you clearly create work. I mean, everything from cartoon, animated videos to kind of popular magazine pieces, Counterpunch, Truth Out, work for non-academic audiences. You've told us a little bit about how you got here, but I wondered if you might reflect a little bit more for those of us listening from academia, from outside of it. What do you see as your responsibility, or as the responsibility and opportunities today for left intellectuals who do see the need for system change, but who still may be ensnared in various ways in this very, as you've described it, very kind of compromised academic environment? How did you get out, if you will? And what advice or reflections do you have for other folks who are maybe dealing with that tension between being a kind of having a radical analysis, but being often maybe cut off from the publics that might help to actualize those ideas?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and many things rush into my mind. I think the most important one is to say to you that I was able to do that under conditions that were worse for doing this than the ones you now face. So I guess this is a polite way of saying you have no excuse not to be doing this yourself. We need you to do it. You can do it. And if I'm effective in how I mix my metaphors and present myself and the style, of course, I'm a performer and I understand it. But so are those of you that teach, Joe, and I don't know the rest of you, but if you're a teacher, in a television culture, you better be a performer, or else no one's going to be listening or watching what you're doing up
Absolutely.
there, and you're going to feel very bad about it. So here are some of the things you might want to think about. I always thought teaching is supposed to take stuff that is complicated, murky, confused, and make it clearer. Not because the student, once he or she learns, won't later on find that it's not quite so clear, that there's this and that. No, but that has to happen later. At first, you got to get them to understand the basic reality that they're coping with or trying to understand. That's what a good teacher is there for. Before I did economics, I did mathematics. I could have easily spent my life, as so many of my colleagues have, writing endless complicated equations on the board, making everyone in the room feel inadequate because they didn't quite understand it. I understand there are certain kinds of egos that get stroked in that way. Luckily, I didn't need it. My ego got stroked other ways, but I didn't need that particular one. Plus, I was keenly aware as a mathematician that the mathematics the economists were doing was childish. This was stuff you do in the 2nd grade. It's as if a cookbook writer suddenly presented himself as a great nutritionist, No, I mean, there is a science called nutrition, but that's not what you do. You explain to us how to make brownies. And that's useful. I'm glad you're here, but that's not what economics, ought to be the way that young people interested in knowing how the world works get a really good grounding in that. And there's no need to shy away from disagreement. What's the problem here? This economist thinks capitalism is wonderful. This one thinks it's a disaster. Okay, you know what? Every time I have been in that situation, students find that exciting. They're interested to see in how it is viewed differently, because they and their roommates, they and their parents, they and their friends have those kinds of arguments, at least in embryo, and they would like to see how this kind of goes. I mean, it's a shame if it becomes nasty and everybody's just romping on everybody else, but assume a better quality of debate and you begin to see what the issues are in a way you can never get if there isn't the dialogue, the two alternatives, or more than two, contesting with one another. Anyway, that's what I tried to do. I tried to do it in the classroom. I don't come from wealth, and my parents were immigrants, as I told you. They had no money. So for me, I had to get a university job because I had to earn a living. I was and am married, and I have 2 children. So if you're an American male with a wife and 2 children, you got to go to work. How else are you going to live? And so I had to have university jobs as my basis. But, and maybe this is an important point, from the beginning, with only half an awareness of what I was doing, I always made time to do 2 other things: to involve myself in actual political struggles wherever I was. And number 2, to read in the critical, and for me, it was the Marxian tradition, because I believed then, as I do now, that that is the most developed body of literature critical of capitalism that we have. And not to learn Marxism is a little bit like going camping with a deep principle not to learn about flashlights. Can you stumble through the woods? Sure. Can you get to the place where you make pee-pee? You can. But you're going to stumble and you're going to fall and the mosquitoes are going to get you. So why don't you get a flashlight? They're right down the street at the store. They cost you a couple bucks. Bingo, you will have light in the darkness. For me, not understanding Marxism, not studying it, not reading it, I find that, and being an economist or calling yourself one, it tells you something about this culture that nothing else can. The fear for 50 years, the Cold War that sunk its roots so deeply that people were afraid to learn, like a child, afraid to look at the doggy because then the doggy will bark, And the greatest tragedy is that the Chinese, which is a much more serious competitor of the United States, has had a relatively easy time, even now with these pathetic, it is embarrassing. I go out of the country fairly often. I have to defend my country. It's becoming very difficult because of the childishness. It's just, I'm going to give you one because maybe it's one you ought to hear. There is a tiny minority of Muslims in China. They are called the Uyghur people, and you've heard of them because they're in the news all the time. And something not good is going on between the Chinese and this small group of Muslim people. This kind of thing is happening in many parts of the world, but it's happening in China too. I don't know the details, so I'm not going to comment so much on it. But what I am struck by, and what the world is struck by, is that the United States is very concerned about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. What? The whole rest of the world scratches its head, and I mean this. Your country, the US, has just finished 20 years of systematically destroying 2 Muslim countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. killing unknown numbers of people, wrecking their economy. If you have any doubt, read today about what's going on in Afghanistan. The UN just declared it the worst humanitarian crisis in memory. You're in no position to have a terrible concern about these Muslims. And I'm not saying that the situation there is good or is what the Chinese say. I don't know, and I'm really not interested for this point. But the ability of the United States to imagine that the rest of the world doesn't know what this means, that's childish. They know. Europeans are asking themselves the question now, in numbers and in a serious way that has never existed in my lifetime. And I'm talking about Germany and France, the two key countries in continental Europe. Is our future with the United States or is our future with China? Now, Americans need to pretend that none of this is going on. And by talking carefully only to the American-focused politicians over there, you can keep this delusion going, but no. And here's the final thing to answer Joe's question. I used to have to dance. That's what I called it. Dance around what I had to teach by not saying certain kinds of words because people would freak out. I couldn't say, I'm going to use Marxian value theory to analyze this question. It's not that people were resistant to it. I just had to use neutral words that Marx couldn't be mentioned, value theory probably couldn't be. And I had to, and then the idea was fine, no problem. It was the lingo, it was the associations. I don't have to do that anymore. Look at me, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing with you tonight if I had to dance all the time. I don't anymore. I do a weekly radio and television show. It is broadcast on about 100 radio stations across America. It is produced simultaneously as a radio show and a television show, and it goes around the country on 4 television networks into approximately 55 million homes. A regular weekly presentation that is critical of capitalism systematically. And you know what? I could, if I had more resources, I could do twice that. My problem is I need people like you, people that are interested. By the way, I started doing this, I quote, retired from UMass in 2008. And so I've been kind of doing this on my own. And I started just letting people know, if you're interested, I'll come and do it. So I got approached by the New School here in New York City, New School University. And here's what they proposed, just to give you an idea how America has changed so that you will be less hesitant. When they came and they hired me, they said, we want you to be a visiting professor. Fine, I said, I'm interested in doing that. I live in Manhattan, that's where I'm sitting now, and it's literally a 4-minute walk from my apartment to my classroom where I teach at the New School. They said, well, you know, you're pretty well known, so here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to make you the NASDAQ visiting professor, which I am. That's America. Think about it.
All right.
And if I can be the NASDAQ professor, then there's a lot of things you can do you might have thought you can't. I have been invited to speak on Fox News 6 times. It isn't what it was. The left in America, and if you mean by that, the part of the population that's thinking critically, that's interested in hearing critical thinking, it's enormous. When I started, I was alone. I now have formed this group called Democracy at Work. And I have, ready, 2 full-time, 2 half-time, and 2 gig workers, all of whose salaries and insurance coverage I pay. And I don't mind telling you, I pay because the money comes in too. Just supporters, not people. I mean, I don't send gifts. No, I'm not selling anything. This is people when we say, we'd like you to support us so I can do all this work. We can produce these videos. We can produce the radio and television show and all the rest of it. Up until the pandemic, you know where I produced my weekly show? In the YouTube studios in Manhattan, at their invitation, and the price was very attractive, $0. I had, I don't know, $1 million worth of cameras. I could never afford in a million years. But the YouTube, they can afford everything. They bought God and several other planets. Okay, so, you know, but it's not what you thought. And for those of you stuck in economics, or to be even more blunt, stuck in academia, you may not understand this, but you live in a very strange world. For the half of the country that's right wing, they think Marxists control American universities. Yeah, you have to laugh. But the minute you stop laughing, you realize, what does it tell you about a country where half the people are convinced of something completely nutty, has never been true, and is not true now, not even in the slightest? That's the interesting thing. What sociologically explains such psychic dissonance as this? But I can tell you for sure, I really mean this. I need you. This country needs you all out there doing whatever version of what I'm doing in your own way, with your own style, to your own audiences. But don't let anyone tell you that this isn't an opportunity. This moment in American history is priceless. For most of the last 75 years, left-wing people were quite right to say, we can't do anything. The police, the media, it's all kind of arranged. We can't. And there was a lot of truth in that. But now the opening is there. Now, if we don't take advantage of it, that's on us, not on the system now. And all I can tell you is, I'm not tired at the end of the day. Even today, with this be my 5th. And you can probably tell from watching me. But in case you're not clear, let me make it real clear. I'm having the time of my life.
Beautiful. And this is such a perfect comment, because we're going to open up this space, and Professor Wolff has told us that he does not have a hard stop at 8:30, and he's clearly got some energy. So we are going to take our first round of questions from our live Zoom audience. I believe we have 3 folks in the queue already. Juliana Barnett has the first one. We'll actually take them in 3 if we can, Rick, so you can have kind of 3 to work with, so we can get in a few voices here. Maybe do 2 rounds of questions. We'll have Juliana, then we'll have our co-producer Mark Soderstrom, and after that, I believe we'll have Francis Madison, who I'm a comrade who's on this call, very glad, from the West Coast. So Juliana, are you there? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question to our guest? Juliana? There you are. All right.
Yes.
Welcome, Juliana. Please ask your question.
Thank you. Well, it's really fascinating to hear such an energizing talk. I am really interested, well, it's extremely interesting to hear what happens in academia and the weird atmosphere around these truths and all of the smoke and mirrors. I am interested in how, could you summarize some of the pro-capitalist narrative that is disseminated, that has to be disseminated among the general populace, that it does not have to, it's not subject to all these special academic smoke and mirrors, but is in fact living all this reality, and yet is well, one of the main things that strike me is the characterization of the workplace as anti-democratic, and in fact, schools are anti-democratic, and basically all all the institutions that we have are entirely anti-democratic. I mean, not only undemocratic, but anti-democratic. And we know there's nowhere where people learn to live or to have the opportunity to participate in a democracy. And so I just wonder what it is you think that is said to people, that is imbued in people, to have people be able to go along with this and not totally say, how is this possible?
Okay, and next we're going to actually take three at a time. And next we have Mark Soderstrom, and then after that we'll take Francis. Mark, you there?
Yes, thank you so much for such an energizing presentation. And you have so powerfully sort of communicated how the pandemic has shown the weakness of the productive side of the capitalist economy. But it seems to me that contemporary capitalism also sort of is actively impoverishing the reproductive side of the economy in its attempts to retain those profits that it maximizes, that it also works to maximize. I'm sort of curious if you could sort of expand out of the workplace. And do you see any of your work in conversation with people like Nancy Fraser, who talks about the crisis of care, or some of the Marxist feminist economists who are working in sort of social reproduction theory these days as a way to use Marxism to talk about other broader issues beyond the workplace? Thank you so much.
Great question about the crisis of care. And last but not least, Francis.
Hi, Dr. Wolff. It's such a joy and such a pleasure to see you. We've spoken on the phone before, and this is just a thrill. I actually don't live on the West Coast. I live in the South. I'm in central Louisiana, and I'm a day's drive from a few crucial strikes that are happening. The John Deere, the Kellogg, and the Met Warrior strike. And I am very eager to visit the strikes and to try and discover any commonalities and interconnectednesses, especially with a little bit, I guess, of an agenda of creating momentum, perhaps investigating if there is something, like a strike wave happening or some resurgence in the South, specifically with respect to the labor movement. But as you know, in media, you can't just say, I want to go on a voyage of discovery. You have to, come up with some kind of an articulated framework. And the thing that feels resonant to me is this connection between the anti-democracy of the workplace and our anti-democracy kind of writ large. And I just was hoping that you might, lay some of your shimmering, multifaceted insights on me, about how to connect some of these dots.
All right, great. Three questions there, each pretty juicy and full. But Professor Wolff, crisis of care, the strike wave, question mark, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase Juliana's question, but take it away.
All right. About the pro-capitalist narratives, I did not want to be dismissive. The people who love capitalism have been in charge of the profession now for a long time. They've gotten rid of the critics, most of them, certainly all the Marxist ones. So they haven't had to work very hard. I can tell you this because I don't enjoy debates, because in this country, the debate very often degenerates pretty quickly into the kind of debates politicians have, where you try to have a clever one-liner that makes the other person look bad or something like that. I'm really not interested, but I do it. And you might like to know why I do it. Because I enjoy the discomfiture of the neoclassical and Keynesian economists, which I can recognize is just the fruit of their lopsided education. These are very smart people. They're very capable people. It's just, they don't know. And they never learned this, and they never took the time and trouble to learn it on their own. Once they do, and they are going to be forced to in the months and years ahead, they will come up with much better critiques of my position than they're now capable of. They're just not used to it. So I sit down with them, and it doesn't take me very long, since I've had to work ceaselessly to criticize them, and they haven't had a problem dealing with people like me because they just tuned us out. That makes for a very unfair struggle for them. And I will not deny there's a certain pleasure in that for me. If you ever want to see that, I assume most of you know Amy Goodman, who does the Daily. Well, she, a little while ago, she brought me and Paul Krugman together on her program, and we had a little of a back and forth. And you might be interested in the substance, but whether or not you are, look at his face as the conversation, because he's not had to do that. He knows me, by the way. It's not that. He's not had to do this, and none of them do. So here's the stories they tell each other, which they really love and which the public picks up. Here's the first one, and probably the single most important one. Capitalism enables you to start your own business and build it up, and therefore you can become very successful and you can become very rich. And I'm not critical, these people say, of the folks like Jeffrey Bezos or Elon Musk or any of those people, because they took advantage of a system that allows you to start a new business and thrive and reap the rewards. Whereas socialism and communism don't let you do that. Okay, let's look at this. Socialism and communism, I don't know, I assume they mean Scandinavia, Western Europe, Russia, China. I mean, these are the countries that sort of call themselves socialist over recent history. Are you able to start a business there? Of course. Did people start businesses there? Of course. Did those businesses grow and develop? Of course. So the first problem with the narrative is that it is made out of whole cloth. This is inventory junk, but it flies because all the other people in the room, when they say this, are nodding in agreement. Let me give you a few more, and I'll be brief. You know, capitalism allows you to have private property. And if you don't let people have private property, well, then there's no incentive for them to accumulate wealth. Again, once you learn this stuff, you're kind of flabbergasted. So I would ask a person, well, where is it you think there is no private? Well, Russia didn't have any private property. Really, I say. Let me tell you something. The first act of the Russian Revolution, when Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin were sitting in the Winter Palace occupying the position the Tsar used to have, the first act they did was to take the land away from the feudal landlords who had run Russia for centuries and distribute it to the mass of the peasantry as their private property. The Russian Revolution created private property in hundreds of millions of people who had never seen it before. And when I explain this, I get from these people, including the professors, this sort of blank stare, the kind of stare that says, oh boy, do I wish my mother would call me on the phone right now so I could get out of here. Because it's embarrassing. It is embarrassing. You know, China, you know, they have socialism. They have a very powerful communist party, which, by the way, they do. They have a very powerful communist. So you can't, there's no incentive. And I tell them, the country with the most millionaires after the United States, it's the People's Republic of China. And at the pace they're creating, billionaires, at the pace they're creating them, they will outdistance the United States in billionaires within 4 to 5 years. What are you talking about? What? China has started new businesses on a scale the United States can't match, you idiot. But I don't say that last bit about the idiot because I'm not a nasty person. But you have to recognize there's these words, these phrases that have become repeated so often that they go in as a kind of absolute truth. Here's another one. capitalism is really efficient. What? What? Let's go back. Every 4 to 7 years, this system crashes. You know, our vocabulary, recession, depression, crisis, crash, downturn. I mean, our language is rich with terms for something that's so frequent. And guess what happens during every crash? Millions of people lose their job. Millions of businesses go out of business. That's not efficient, Jack. That means tons of stuff is sitting there not being used. That's not efficient. Millions of people are plunged into, and then I rattle off the data. Unemployment, that when it goes up, makes for more mental illness, makes more for physical illness, makes for more child abuse, sexual abuse, alcoholism, you name it. And that's what we do every 4 to 7 years. We visit this crap on our people. This is not efficient. Maybe what you mean is inside the capitalist enterprise, there's a push to be efficient. Yeah, but you have to weigh that against the macro level where the inefficiency is mind-blowing. Moreover, what is this efficiency really? How does it work? And then they get excited because they think they got me here, okay? They say, well, everybody in capitalism is taught you have to weigh the goods and the bads, the costs and the benefits. We even teach students whole semesters on how to do cost-benefit analysis with the appropriate econometrics alongside. And then I look at them, and now I'm a mathematician. Tell me, you're going to measure the efficiency of something, anything, or compare the efficiency, say, of Russia and the United States by looking at whether the positive outcomes of any act are greater than the negative. In other words, should the company expand its factory, it does a cost-benefit analysis. You know how I know that? Because when I was younger, to make extra money, I did that because I had my Harvard pedigree, and they needed the name of a Harvard pedigree on the report to use it. But I knew, and I even had conversations with the corporate vice presidents who hired me, that this exercise was an irrational Fruit Loop activity. Why? Because if you're going to ever measure the positive outcomes of an act, like building a highway or extending a factory, against the negative, you're proposing something that no one can do and that no one has ever done. Why? Because the positive consequences of any act, raising an interest rate, building a factory, rerouting a highway, whatever it is, those are not going to be known until way into the future. You can't weigh the costs and benefits because you don't know the future unless you're a very unusual person, you idiot. Nobody can. Nobody ever has. We don't even know what all the outcomes are, let alone measure them. It would take so long to do that they would be out of date by the time you finished. This is nonsense what you are doing. And then the coup de grace, whether you finish. And when you look at the consequence of your act, tell me, how do you know it's the consequence just of the act you're measuring and not of 50,000 other things going on at the same time? This is a mathematical problem that serious mathematicians have dealt with and have concluded that it's not doable. It's an economic empty set. You know a little bit about set theory. It's an empty set. There's nothing to do. Mathematicians know that, but economists are busy doing what isn't doable and writing papers and giving each other chairs in economic universities for the stunning realization of something which across the campus is understood to be a sign of a mental lapse. This is a profession that is in terrible, terrible trouble. And it has become, by the way, sad, more than angry now. I'm sad about it because millions of young people take courses in economics because they want to understand what is this inflation and what is this strike wave that I'm about to talk about in response to Francis's question and so on. They want to know the really interesting things about economics. How does the job situation shape my family life? About reproduction, for example, and all of that. They want the really interesting questions. And what they get is a course that really is designed for engineers. You learn how this equation relates to that equation, how this part of the machine works. All the juice, all the excitement, all the romance, all the history, all the struggle is carefully cleaned away. And what you got is a large collection of old, dry bones. And that doesn't sustain you unless you're a problem solver like an engineer and you really enjoy showing what the solution to a quadratic equation should look like. It's so sad, but it keeps the ideology going. And here's a way maybe to get you to understand the last thing. Here's the tragedy of tragedies. In every American university, there are actually 2 economics departments. Nobody else has that. There aren't 2 history departments. There aren't 2 English departments. There aren't 2 biology, but there are 2 economics departments. Why? Because over the years, over the last century, but particularly since the end of World War II, the economics departments became an increasing problem for businesses in America. Why? Because what the economics courses were really there to do was to celebrate capitalism, not to analyze it, to come up like an advertiser with 27 positive adjectives you could cleverly associate with this thing so you get the poor slob to go out and buy it. Well, you do that for capitalism. Get the people to buy it by throwing lots of really good, optimization, welfare, maximism. These are wonderful words. This system does all these wonderful things. It's just one. And the businesses complained. We're hiring people who have a BA in economics. They don't know the first thing about running a business. And of course, that was correct. I never taught anybody how to run a business. No one ever asked it of me. No one ever taught me anything. I couldn't teach anybody about that either. So what had to be done was to create a second economics department, which would have a completely different function. Not to celebrate the system. We don't need that. The economics department does that. The second department teaches you how a business actually runs. But to keep people from getting confused, we gave the second economics department a different name. We called it a business school. And so UMass has a business school and an economics department. And never the 2 get together. We don't like each other. We never had coffee. I taught at UMass Boston for 30 years. I didn't know the people in the business department, and they were no more interested in getting to know me than I was in getting to know them. We lived in 2 different universes. They taught students about investment and marketing and all the things a business has to deal with, and we told them how to learn to love the system. And as to the big question at the end, how do we get people to break out of it? I don't think we can do that. They're going to have to do that for themselves. But we can give them a lot to chew on, a lot to think about. Then they'll make that decision. And in case you're wondering, they're making it now. This allows me to jump to Francis's question before I get to the one in the middle. There are 2 statistics I want you to think about. The government keeps a record of what's called the quit rate. It's the rate at which people, workers, quit their jobs. They're not laid off, they're not striking, they just quit. They've had it. I don't know how many of you remember there was a country and western song a couple of decades ago whose key line was, "Take this job and shove it." That was the way this was it. All right. It was a country and western song. It went out of fashion. It's coming right back into fashion, big time. Why? Because millions of Americans, it's in the millions, and we haven't seen numbers like this for 20, 30 years. So it's remarkable. Workers have come back after the pandemic when they were locked out and all the rest. And they're taking a look at this job, which they accepted for decades. And they're saying, I'm out of here. No way are you going to treat me like this anymore. This is of the most importance. The second statistic, it teaches the same lesson. strikes. There was the question from the other questioner. That's right, John Deere, Kellogg, earlier this summer, Nabisco, the vote going on with the Hollywood people out there who are writing and so forth. You're seeing a strike wave we haven't seen for a long time either. Unions and workers voting not to accept what they accepted before. The strike at John Deere has a lot to do with the tier system. The way capitalists worked in this country, particularly the last 25 years, is by bribing the existing workers. In other words, the contract would read, those of you that are working and getting $27 an hour, you can keep it. But in return, you've got to allow us to say that newly hired workers start at $14 an hour. And then you don't let them rise the way you let the earlier generation. And that way the company is saving a fortune of money. And who votes on the contract? The people who have the job. The people who haven't got it yet have no vote. So obviously this is great. This makes a joke out of democratic voting by a union membership, which the good union leaders told their people. But the workers were so frightened, they were so worried that they accepted. They let the two tiers happen. By the way, we wouldn't have an automobile industry in America if they didn't. GM, Ford, they've all used this two-tier system. By the way, the ratio is roughly $28 an hour to 14, 50% different. Two people working next to each other doing exactly the same work, one gets paid twice what the other one does. And you think that doesn't destroy union solidarity, think again. But you're seeing in the quit rate and in this strike wave, which is remarkable, and you're seeing not only that workers are beginning to say, this is not acceptable, but even more important, the mainstream media is full of people that are giving these facts exposure. I can tell immediately because I get called by a lot of the big media to comment. And I'm commenting left and right on the quitting, on the strikes, all the time. And so I noticed this is also very important that the media, or at least a good number of people in the media, also sense that this is important and want to have the reporter. They want it on the evening news. They want a feature on it. This is as important almost as the event itself. And I think you should all take heart, because I've been talking to the audiences that are in a way the first wave. Now you're seeing the second wave, and the second wave is the working class beginning. And that's partly the work we've done. I'm proud of that. We're out there making these arguments, and they filter down, they percolate down all over the place in ways that are always surprising me. And I work with unions and I do all of that kind of stuff. But I want you to know really that, again, the opportunities are stunning, but you have to learn it on your own. I have to tell you, just honestly, if you find what I'm doing interesting, and you've been very kind in your comments, you've been using words like, oh, it's energizing, or thing. Look, partly it's that. I am a performer. I work at that. By the way, some of you have asked me in the past, the style I use. I have one person who taught me my style, and that's a comedian by the name of Richard Pryor. I'm a student of Richard Pryor's comedic style. But if that's what you think I'm doing, you're leaving something out. Everything I've told you tonight may be put in a clever way or may be presented with energy, but it's an argument, an analytical argument. And in order for me to have made that, I had to learn Marxist theory. There is no shortcut. It's not going to come to you in an inspirational moment, one afternoon. That's not the way this works. And you don't become a Marxist by one day saying, I'm tougher than the other radicals in my little group. I'm a Marxist. It's very nice. I'm glad you do that. I applaud. But that don't make you a Marxist. It just doesn't. You have to be able to be for those you touch, whether you're a teacher or you're a co-worker with people or your friends or family. If you're going to be helping people to understand and change both their personal lives and the larger system, you've got to have a framework which can do that, which can use an apparatus even as new events explode all around us, as they always will. You need to learn Marxism because it's the best. Are there things that are wrong with it? Of course. Are there areas it's blind to? Of sure. This is nobody wants you to be some kind of acolyte. This is not a religion, but this is an apparatus that's very useful, and you can learn and you can persuade. If you find what I do persuasive, I owe it to Marxism, not to my mother and father, and not to my teachers, and I've had good ones and crappy ones. But that edifice, that way of thinking that I got from Marx and other Marxists, not just from him, is invaluable. I mean, and I feel badly for my friends, because I still have friends who are right-wing economists and in the middle, because I went to those schools and I know those people and they know me. And so we get together every now and then for coffee or a beer or something, and we talk. And so, I mean, I know them. They're nice people, many of them. I can talk to them about neoclassical economics because I had to learn it and I had to teach it. And I can talk to them about Keynesian economics because I had to learn it and I had to teach it. But when I start to talk about Marxian economics, they go to sleep. And not because they're impolite or we get along fine, but they just can't go there. It's as if I suddenly started speaking German and they would listen to the sounds, but after a while, you know, since they don't know what the words mean, it gets boring. That's what it is with Marxism. And that's their loss. It's really their loss. Okay, about reproduction. Marxists that I've worked with took the Marxist edifice and went to work on that area, but in a somewhat different way than is now popular. Since I'm no expert on what is now popular, I thought I'd take a few minutes and tell you about the direction that the group I was part of went to. And that work is published and available if you're interested in it. The question these Marxists answered was absolutely revolutionary. They said, you know, the whole edifice of Marxian analysis has been focused on the enterprise, the factory, the office, the store, and so forth. You know, the places we all recognize as where you go to do business. But that's not the only place that Marxian class analysis might have something to teach. And the direction we, because I was part of this, went was to ask a whole new set of questions about the household, that other location that you go back to at the end of your time in the workplace, you know, for dinner and sleeping and breakfast and before you go back to work on the weekend and all that. And we asked the question, is the apparatus of Marxian economics applicable? Does it have anything to offer, anything to say? And we went very open. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's a good reason that Marxists have been very scarce on doing that kind of a opening that question, let alone pursuing it. And our decision was that Marxism is extraordinarily insightful in this area. And I haven't got the time to do it, but if any of you are interested, if Joe, you can forward to me people who would be interested, I'd be glad to send books or articles you can pursue this in. But here's in a nutshell. Okay. Is Marxism an analysis of work? Answer, yes. It's about the work people do. It's a theory of production as well as distribution of goods and services. So the question is the household a site in society where work is done? Second question, if there is work being done, can one usefully say that there is necessary work and surplus work, the way Marx makes that inquiry for slavery, for feudalism, and for capitalism? Remember in early volume 1, Marx lays out the difference between the value added by a worker when he or she works, and that part of that comes back to the worker as a wage, but another part, the surplus, is appropriated by the employer, and out of that comes the whole structure. Is something, here comes the big one, is something like that going on in the household? And the answer, which we kind of didn't dare tell each other as we did this work, but the answer was yes. In fact, it's really easy once you ask the question to see it. It's always that way, you know. Once Freud asks the question, do people have a mind other than the mind we know about? By asking that question, that was the breakthrough. The answer came quickly. It was the question. And he said, yes, we have a conscious mind and we have an unconscious mind. And when things happen to us, we react partly with our conscious mind, and we also react with the unconscious mind. And when you watch people, you can begin to figure out how that unconscious is working. You know, how you try to answer the question, why am I married to this person rather than all the others I could have married? Right? Those honest questions, you realize you're kind of never going to answer, partly because it's very scary going there. So we put it aside. But our answer was yes. In the classic American household, women are the producers of a surplus appropriated by their husbands. That the class structure and the struggle exist not just in the workplace, but in the home, with the added complexion of its being a very gendered class structure and a very gendered class struggle. And then we said, well, what might it mean if this is true and we could show it? I mean, and by the way, we did that kind of work. We used people who had studied, like Frederick Taylor did, had struggled the household. The woman who makes the bed, she doesn't just make the side of the bed where her body was, she makes the other side of the bed too. She does labor, in this case, bed making, for herself, necessary labor. She wants to have a bed that's neat and clean to get into at night, but she does it for him. She cooks her meal, she cooks his. You know, what's going on here? Does the reverse happen? It could. We could have complicated class structures, just like we do in an enterprise. And we began to say, my goodness, what happens to, for example, just to tantalize you, what happens to a love relationship, the affective drawing together of two people in what let's call a love relationship, if it has to coexist in the household with another relationship, unconscious, in which one of them is a surplus producer for the other, which means the other is exploiting the first one. How long will your love last if it is tested against exploitation? Not where you thought it was at the workplace, but right there in the kitchen, in the living room, and then when it gets really complicated, in the bedroom. Well, it turns out it was wonderful. I worked for years with a variety of people, economists, psychologists, and others who were Marxists, trying to develop this apparatus. And by the way, I think we're at the very beginning. I'm a Marxist, but I'm telling you, there's huge areas of life that Marxism hasn't begun to figure out. This is not a finished body of work, not at all. It's got some really good stuff you could work with, but it's got an enormity of stuff to ask about, to see about. Nor am I at all against playing with other traditions. This is not, it's not that you join my church and you have to quit all the others. Not at all. I don't believe in any of that. I think Marxism has shaped the other things in this world and been shaped by them. And that's not going to stop. And therefore, I have no notion you shouldn't. I'm glad I learned neoclassical economics. I am. I'm glad I learned Keynesian economics for many reasons. I learned and I did things in and for Marxian economics that I got from those other traditions. And they do too. I'm willing to admit it. They usually aren't. Because of their fear. It's not an intellectual. This is fear. And your generation isn't afraid. That's a whole nother thing that those of you that are younger, it's hard for you to get this. But those of us that are older, We grew up in an America that made all of this stuff taboo. And that the taboo runs very deep and comes and surprises you in odd ways when you least expect it. But it shapes you, even if you're set against it, like I've always felt I was. You know, being against something is being shaped by it too. You could be shaped to be like it, and you could be shaped to be driven against it. You're still shaped by it. And that is a trap if you're not very self-conscious about it. And I don't want to be trapped there. So, for example, I was fascinated by the whole intellectual tradition that swept through academia in the 1980s and 90s, called, for lack of a better name, postmodernism. I thought it was wonderful. I thought it had an enormous amount to teach Marxism. I also thought it went the other way, that postmodernists could learn a lot from Marxism. Most of them were very uninterested in doing that, which was funny because most of them had been Marxists before they got captured by postmodernism. And I'm thinking here particularly of the French, who played a very important kind of key role with people like Derrida and Foucault and all of those folks who had a very important role to play. But I always thought that the intersection, the coming together of postmodernism in philosophy and so on, and Marxism was a very fruitful interchange, that Marxists had a lot. I learned enormous amounts that are in the kind of Marxism I do, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So this is not, you don't have to live under the shadow of that taboo, because your generation doesn't feel it. For them, the Russian Revolution, you know, it happened as far back as Thucydides or something. It's very ancient, you know. It's not the Vietnam War. I had to learn. For many of my students now, what, you know, it's also Thucydides, you know. And it's terrible in some ways, but it's also liberating in others. It's the dialectic of it all. You don't have to worry as much as you thought you did. People are much less trapped in those ways of thinking, including the fear. It's still there. The whole working class in this country has a deep gut feeling of anxiety about going to the left. And it couldn't be otherwise. For 75 years, you got into trouble. And your uncle told you a story, and your grandmother told you a story, and you add all those up, and you knew, don't go there. The right wing doesn't have that problem. You could go in that direction. It had none of the comparable taboos, which is why when this country hits a problem, the people go first to the right. It's a much more ready, available, recognizable, acceptable way to go. The left is always going to come later. You have to kind of learn that the right didn't solve anything. Americans, working class people that I deal with, they are figuring out that 4 years of Trump, whom they voted for, didn't change anything. They're very suspicious of Biden. They basically think he's another one. So they don't even expect very much. But they're not, their attitude towards Trump now, much less positive than it was 2 years ago, 4 years ago. So anyway, the bottom line, please join us. And on a personal note, again, this is very satisfying work. This is way better than teaching at the university, for me, ever was. And I liked it. I was not regretful that I became a professor. My father was a lawyer, and he had ideas that I would go in that direction, and I toyed with it. But I've never regretted that I've been an academic, and not the least because, given what I said to you before, if you understood it, being active politically, independently, with another intellectual political project is the best possible way to make your economics end up socially useful.
Professor Wolff, this is
Don't let the last thing, don't let the university make you as narrow as they try to do. Don't do that. Take courses in other topics, open yourself up, read novels, do all kinds of things other than the narrow drone that this system is trying to make you be. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, please. I feel like I want to talk to you for another 2 hours. It's incredibly inspiring moment and thought to wrap up on. I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. I also just wanted to note your work was definitely a major reason why I went into economics. I'm sure that you're doing lots of inspiring work for everyone else watching now. So thank you so much.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you. And again, I really meant it as I began tonight. I appreciate your invitation. I appreciate that you're making an organization doing these that's exactly what has to happen. It has to happen a million places in a million different ways, but you're doing it and you're making these things happen in Boston. And that is absolutely what you could and should be doing to change the country. The only hope we have.
Thank you, Professor Wolff, Professor Richard Wolff, ladies and gentlemen. What a 2 hours that was. I hope we can have you back sometime, Rick. This was a really great first extended conversation. And as you said, there's many more issues to unpack, but we really, you gave us a lot to think about on so many fronts tonight. And I just double Rachel's thank you. I will say I used to go to that Rethinking Marxism conference all the time, so I'm very in debt, to the Marxist workout in UMass Amherst. I'm at UMass Boston now, and we're building the old moles at work as it has been on Columbia Point for a long time. I'm going to wrap up the show here with a couple things we need to say, which is that the show would not be possible without the entire Shelter and Solidarity collective. That's Linda Liu, Kira Mudliar, Seren Mudliar, Rachel Yaroshish Patton, myself, Tim Sheard, Mark Soderstrom, and I want to welcome our newest member of the collective, another UMass Boston student joining us, Lena Durkin. Lena, it is great to have you joining us. For those who don't know, Shelter and Solidarity has a regular, often twice a month, sometimes once a month, Thursday evening show. And you can find all of our past shows on our website at shelterandsolidarity.org, shelterandsolidarity.org. We also have a channel on YouTube and a page on Facebook. We do need your help promoting the show. We don't have the money to do the work for us. We need people joining us. And if you're interested in getting more involved in the collective, please do reach out. We have some exciting shows coming up in this fall as we move towards the chilly months here on the Northeast. We have Jeremy Brecker, the labor historian, among other things, coming on November 18th. And we have the very important socialist feminist critic of the family institution under capitalism, Sophie Lewis, coming on December 12th. We'll be picking up that conversation about production, reproduction, the family. Finally, I want to thank our co-producers, the Community Church of Boston, a free community for the study and practice of universal religion, Encuentro Cinco, affectionately known as E5, a movement building project in downtown Boston, Hardball Press, a leading publisher of labor and social justice stories for adults and children. You can find them at hardballpress.com as the holiday season descends. Think about Hardball Press as a destination for the young ones and the older ones in your life. Also, the Liberty Tree Foundation, an organization serving the democratic revolutionary movement. And last but certainly not least, the journal Socialism and Democracy, a journal that brings together the worlds of scholarship and activism, theory and practice to examine in depth the core issues and popular movements of our time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rachel, for hosting with me. This is a joy, as always. I hope we can do it again.
Thank you. It was great to speak with you all. And thank you.
And thank everybody. Have a great night and solidarity.